autumn of 1538, the most powerful military coalition in the history of the Christian world assembled in the waters of the Ionian Sea. Pope Paul III had spent 2 years building it. He had called on Spain, the most powerful empire in the Western world, with its vast American colonies and its armies of professional soldiers. He had called on Venice, the greatest naval power the Mediterranean had ever produced, with centuries of maritime experience and a fleet that had once ruled these waters without challenge. He had called on the Papal States, the Maltese Knights, the Genoese. He had gathered a fleet of approximately 300 ships and nearly 60,000 men. He had blessed it personally. He had told the men who commanded it that they were sailing in the name of God against the enemies of Christendom. Their enemy was a single man commanding approximately 122 Ottoman galleys. His name was Hayreddin Barbarossa. He was born the son of a potter on a Greek island. He had grown up as a sailor, a merchant, and then a corsair operating in the narrow waters between the Christian and Islamic worlds. He had fought his way from nothing to everything, from a small trading vessel shared with his brothers to the command of an entire sea, building his power through violence, cunning, alliance, and a quality of tactical brilliance that no opponent had yet found an answer to. On September 28, 1538, at the Battle of Preveza, Barbarossa's 122 galleys engaged the 300 ships of the Holy League. The Holy League was destroyed, not damaged, not forced to withdraw, destroyed as a coherent fighting force, broken apart, scattered across the Ionian Sea, its admirals unable to coordinate, its ships captured or sunk or fleeing for safe harbors. In a battle that lasted hours, the combined naval power of the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, Venice, and the Knights of Malta was beaten by an Ottoman admiral who had once been a corsair raiding coastal villages for a living. The consequences of Preveza lasted 33 years. For 3 decades after that battle, the Ottoman Empire dominated the Mediterranean Sea absolutely. No Christian power had the naval strength or the will to challenge it directly. The trade routes, the islands, the coastal cities, the strategic choke points of the most economically important body of water in the world were under Ottoman control, enforced by the fleet that Barbarossa had built and commanded. One man had done this. One man who began with a pottery business and a small boat had made himself the lord of an entire ocean. This is the story of Hayreddin Barbarossa, the corsair who became an admiral, the pirate who became a statesman, the man who changed the map of the Mediterranean world and died quietly in his bed in Constantinople at the age of approximately 68, having outlived every enemy who had tried to kill him, outlasted every political alliance that had been formed against him, and spent his final years writing his memoirs. His memoirs. The most feared man in the Mediterranean for 3 decades sat down in his retirement and wrote about his life. The world he described is extraordinary. The Barbarossa brothers were born on the island of Lesbos, which the Ottomans called Midilli, off the western coast of what is now Turkey. Lesbos had been captured by the Ottomans in 1462, and Hayreddin, whose birth name was Khizr, was born around 1478, approximately 16 years after the Ottoman conquest, into a household that embodied the complex cultural reality of the Eastern Mediterranean at that time. His father, Yakup Aga, was a former Ottoman Sipahi, a cavalry soldier who had settled on the island after the conquest. He had converted to Islam and taken up the trade of a potter, transporting his goods by sea across the island's waters into the mainland. His mother, Katerina, was a Greek Orthodox woman, a native of the island from before the Ottoman conquest. The household where Hayreddin grew up was simultaneously Ottoman and Greek, Muslim and Christian, soldier and merchant, and the specific combination of identities that this produced in him would define his entire career. He had 3 brothers, Ishak, Oruç, and Ilyas. All 4 of them took to the sea from their father's example, and eventually from necessity, since the pottery trade of Lesbos was not going to make any of them wealthy or powerful. The sea was the road to everything in the eastern Mediterranean in the late 15th century, and the Barbarossa brothers took that road with a commitment that eventually consumed 3 of their 4 lives. Ilyas, the youngest, was the first to die at sea, killed in an engagement with the Knights of St. John, the military religious order that controlled the island of Rhodes and policed the maritime trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean with aggressive enthusiasm. The Knights of St. John were effectively Christian privateers operating under a papal commission, and they regarded any Muslim ship in their waters as fair prey. The Barbarossa brothers' trade routes crossed the Knights' patrol areas constantly, and the tension between the 2 parties was a permanent feature of their early maritime careers. When Ilyas was killed, the surviving brothers made a decision. They had been merchants who sometimes engaged in piracy as an opportunistic supplement to their trade. After Ilyas, they became corsairs who occasionally traded when the opportunity presented itself. The distinction is significant. A merchant who occasionally steals is fundamentally a businessman. A corsair who occasionally trades is fundamentally a fighter. The Barbarossa brothers crossed that line after Ilyas, and they did not cross back. Oruç, the eldest surviving brother, became the dominant figure in the early phase of their corsair career. He was physically imposing, reportedly with the red beard that gave all the brothers their European nickname, Barbarossa being Italian for red beard. He was brave to the point of recklessness, a charismatic leader who attracted fighters and sailors with a combination of personal force and genuine tactical ability. And Oruç, like Ilyas before him, eventually ran into the Knights of St. John. He was captured and held prisoner on the island of Rhodes for approximately 3 years. Hayreddin spent those 3 years doing what was necessary to free his brother. He raided, he traded when he could, he accumulated money through every means available to him. He built the network of contacts and the reputation that would support everything that followed. And eventually, either through ransom or through escape, Oruç was free. The brothers reunited. They had now lost one brother to the Knights and spent years recovering from the capture of another. Their relationship with the Christian maritime world had moved from commercial tension to something closer to permanent war. They were ready to become something bigger than corsairs. The early 16th century Mediterranean was a world in violent transformation. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim I and then Suleiman the Magnificent was expanding in every direction, bringing Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and the Balkans under its control and pressing against the borders of Persia in the east and Christian Europe in the west. The Holy Roman Empire under Charles V controlled Spain, Austria, the Spanish colonies in the Americas, large parts of Italy, and the Low Countries. These 2 superpowers were not yet at direct war with each other, but the trajectory of their expansion made conflict inevitable. Between them, along the southern coast of the Mediterranean, in what is now Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, was a band of territory that both powers wanted to influence and neither fully controlled. The local rulers of these coastal regions, the emirs and sultans of the Berber kingdoms, were maneuvering between the 2 great powers, accepting Ottoman or Spanish patronage when it served them and rejecting it when it did not. The Barbarossa brothers saw an opportunity. In 1504, Oruç and Hayreddin were operating off the coast of Tunisia with a small fleet of galleys, raiding Spanish shipping and accumulating the reputation that would eventually make them the most feared names in the Western Mediterranean. Their raids were not random. They targeted specific categories of ships, particularly Spanish vessels and the ships of the Knights of St. John, the two entities they had most reason to regard as enemies. They avoided or negotiated with other shipping when possible. Oruç, in particular, developed a reputation that went beyond simple piracy. In 1504, he intercepted two large papal galleys that were transporting Moorish and Jewish refugees who had been expelled from Spain after the Reconquista, forced out of a country where their families had lived for generations, now being transported somewhere, exactly where being a matter of some ambiguity. Oruç took the ships, freed the passengers, and transported them to safety in North Africa. This action, whether motivated by genuine sympathy for the expelled communities or by the practical benefits of acquiring a reputation for protecting Muslims and Jews from Christian persecution, defined the public identity of the Barbarossa brothers in a way that served them enormously well throughout their careers. They were not random criminals. They were defenders of the faith against Christian aggression, champions of the communities that Christian Spain had expelled or oppressed. This framing was not entirely false. It was also not the complete picture, but it gave them a political identity that made them genuinely popular in the Muslim world in a way that pure pirates never achieved. Through the first decade of the 16th century, the brothers extended their operations westward along the North African coast. They raided Spanish outposts. They negotiated with local rulers. They accumulated ships, men, and money with a consistency that reflected careful planning rather than opportunistic violence. And in 1516, Oruç made the move that transformed the brothers from powerful corsairs into genuine political actors. He seized Algiers. The city of Algiers was a significant North African port that had been under loose Spanish influence since an earlier Spanish campaign. The local ruler, a man named Selim ibn Tumi, had asked Oruç for help against the Spanish, and Oruç had responded by killing Selim ibn Tumi and declaring himself the Sultan of Algiers. This was not subtlety. This was ambition operating at full speed. Oruç was now not a corsair with political connections. He was a ruler, the sultan of an actual city with actual territory and a population that had its own expectations and its own politics. He managed this for approximately 2 years, defending Algiers against Spanish counterattacks, expanding his territory in the hinterland, and building the kind of administrative infrastructure that keeping a city running required. He died doing it. In 1518, the Spanish launched a major campaign to retake the territory the Barbarossas had seized. Oruç was caught by Spanish forces at the city of Tlemcen and killed. The specific account of his death varies across sources, but he died fighting, which was entirely consistent with how he had lived. Hayreddin was now alone. His brother was dead. His other brother, Ishak, died around the same time. Of the 4 potters' sons from Lesbos, only Hayreddin survived. He inherited everything: the ships, the men, the territory, the name Barbarossa, and the war against Spain that Oruç's ambitions had created. He was somewhere around 40 years old. He was just beginning. Hayreddin's first decision after his brother's death was the one that changed his career from a regional power struggle into a geopolitical transformation of the Mediterranean. He offered Algiers to the Ottoman Sultan. This was a radical move, and understanding why requires understanding the political logic of the Mediterranean world in 1518. Hayreddin was holding Algiers against Spanish pressure, but he was holding it with his own resources, his own men, his own money. He could not hold it indefinitely without reinforcement. The Spanish were the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, and without a counterbalancing force of similar scale, Hayreddin's position in Algiers was ultimately untenable. The Ottoman Empire was the only power in the world that could provide that counterbalance. Hayreddin sent messengers to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I, offering to place Algiers under Ottoman sovereignty. He was not surrendering. He was proposing an alliance, the kind of alliance where both parties got something essential. The Ottomans got a foothold in the Western Mediterranean and a corsair fleet of extraordinary effectiveness placed at the service of Ottoman imperial strategy. Hayreddin got the military and political backing of the most powerful empire in the world. Selim I accepted. Hayreddin became the Ottoman governor of Algiers, with a garrison of Ottoman janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman military, to reinforce his position. He was no longer a corsair with a captured city. He was a representative of the Ottoman Empire. The Spanish had been fighting a corsair. Now they were fighting the Ottoman Empire. The scale of Hayreddin's operations expanded immediately and dramatically. He spent the following decade building Algiers into one of the most formidable naval bases in the Mediterranean. He attracted corsairs from across the region, offering them protection, supplies, and the backing of Ottoman authority. He recruited European renegades, men who had converted to Islam and who brought technical skills, linguistic abilities, and knowledge of Christian military methods that Hayreddin found extremely useful. His fleet grew from a few dozen galleys to a permanent force capable of projecting power across the entire Western Mediterranean, and he used that power relentlessly. The coastal populations of Spain, Italy, and the islands of the Western Mediterranean experienced the expansion of Barbarossa's power as something close to an ongoing nightmare. His galleys ranged from the Balearic Islands in the west to the coasts of Italy and Greece in the east, raiding ports, capturing ships, taking prisoners. The prisoners served two purposes. Some were held for ransom, sold back to their families or to Christian governments for whatever price the traffic would bear. Others were enslaved, put to work in the galleys or sold in the slave markets of North Africa. The slave trade was one of the primary economic foundations of the Barbary corsair system, and Hayreddin was its most effective practitioner in the early 16th century. The exact numbers of people taken into slavery during his career cannot be determined with precision, but the historical record contains enough specific accounts to give a sense of the scale. Thousands of people from the coasts of Spain, Italy, and the Mediterranean islands were enslaved during the years when Barbarossa was at the height of his power. In 1535, after retaking Tunis from the Hafsid Sultan who had invited Spanish assistance, Barbarossa was forced out by a massive Spanish counterattack led by Emperor Charles V himself. He retreated with his fleet, and on the way, he stopped at the island of Minorca in the Balearic Islands. He sacked the city of Mahon. Between 600 and 800 people were taken as slaves. The city was looted. The specific violence of the raid, which targeted a civilian population that had done nothing to provoke it beyond existing in a Spanish-controlled territory, was not an aberration in Barbarossa's career. It was a consistent feature. He sacked the island of Ischia in 1544, taking 4,000 prisoners. He sacked the Lipari Islands in 1544, enslaving between 9,000 and 11,000 inhabitants, in one of the largest single slave raids in the history of Mediterranean piracy. These were not the actions of a man who distinguished between military and civilian targets when military targets were unavailable. The coastal populations of Christian Europe were fair game by his calculation, and his fleet was efficient enough to take advantage of that calculation on a massive scale. The European coastal communities developed elaborate systems in response. Watchtowers were built at intervals along the coastlines of Spain, Italy, and the islands, staffed by men whose specific job was to watch the sea and sound the alarm when Barbary corsairs appeared. The towers were connected by chains of signal fires that could warn a coastal town of approaching raiders in time to allow the population to flee inland. The architecture of coastal defense in the Mediterranean was shaped for centuries by the threat that Hayreddin Barbarossa and the corsair system he led represented. They called the alarm system the alarm of the Moors. The word alarm itself, allarme in Italian, derives from this specific practice. Every time someone says the word alarm today, they are using a word that was coined to describe the terror of seeing Barbarossa's galleys on the horizon. The event that defined Barbarossa's historical significance beyond his career as a corsair was his appointment as Caputan Pasha, Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Navy, by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in 1533. This appointment transformed Hayreddin from a corsair who served Ottoman interests into the supreme commander of the most powerful naval force in the world. It also gave him resources on a scale that no corsair, however successful, could accumulate independently. The Ottoman Navy in the 16th century was an industrial enterprise as much as a military one. Istanbul's shipyards could build galleys at a rate that no Christian power could match. The empire's treasury could fund operations of a scale and duration that private corsair expeditions could never sustain. Hayreddin took this power and used it with the comprehensive strategic vision that had been the consistent characteristic of his career from its earliest days. The first major operation after his appointment as Grand Admiral was the conquest of Tunis in 1534. Tunis was a significant North African city that had been under the control of the Hafsid dynasty and whose ruler had been developing closer relationships with the Spanish. Hayreddin took it in a campaign of remarkable speed and efficiency, capturing the city before Charles V could organize a response. Charles V did eventually respond, launching a major crusading campaign in 1535 with an army of around 40,000 soldiers and a fleet to match. He retook Tunis after a siege and appointed a Hafsid client ruler under Spanish protection. It was the most significant setback of Barbarossa's career, the one time that the forces arrayed against him were large enough and organized enough to defeat him in a direct confrontation. But he escaped with his fleet intact. He was not caught. He was not killed. He was not even significantly weakened in terms of his naval power, because the galleys and the men and the expertise were mobile in a way that a city was not. And then he stopped at Mahon on the way back, as mentioned, and took his revenge on the civilian population because there was no military target available, and because there never seemed to be any consideration in his operational calculus about the distinction. The year after the fall of Tunis, he was back. He was always back. The Spanish could take his cities, but they could not destroy his fleet, and his fleet was what mattered. The Battle of Preveza in September 1538 was the culminating event of the first phase of the Ottoman-Spanish struggle for the Mediterranean, and understanding why it ended as it did requires understanding both the tactical genius of Hayreddin Barbarossa and the fundamental dysfunction of the coalition that opposed him. Pope Paul III had assembled the Holy League with genuine effort over 2 years. The alliance included Spain under Charles V, Venice with its powerful fleet, the Papal States, the Maltese Knights, and Genoese naval forces under the great admiral Andrea Doria. On paper, this was an overwhelming force, 300 ships and 60,000 men against Barbarossa's 122 galleys. But the alliance was not a unified force. It was a collection of competing interests dressed in the language of crusade. Venice wanted to protect its eastern Mediterranean trade routes and was willing to fight for that, but not necessarily for the broader objectives of Charles V. Charles V wanted to destroy Ottoman naval power and was willing to fight for that, but not necessarily at the pace and in the locations that best served Venetian interests. Andrea Doria was a Genoese admiral in Spanish pay who had his own strategic judgments about where and when to fight, judgments that did not always align with those of his nominal superiors. The Papal fleet was the smallest component and had the least influence on major decisions. Hayreddin knew all of this. He knew it partly from intelligence gathered by his network of contacts across the Mediterranean, partly from captured prisoners and from European renegades in his service who understood Christian courts and Christian military culture, and partly from his own acute reading of the political dynamics that the existence of such a coalition always reflected. A coalition built from competing interests has a single point of failure: the moment when the interests diverge significantly enough that coordination becomes impossible. Hayreddin's strategy at Preveza was designed to create exactly that moment. He chose the location carefully. Preveza was a narrow channel near the coast of Greece, where the dynamics of the battle would favor maneuverability over raw firepower. He provoked the coalition fleet into action at a moment and in a manner that created confusion about who was in command of the response. He understood that Andrea Doria, the most capable of the opposing admirals, was fundamentally cautious, a man who calculated odds carefully, and who would not commit his forces to a battle he was not certain of winning. The battle went exactly as Barbarossa planned. Doria, watching the Ottoman galleys maneuver in ways that suggested a trap, withdrew his forces from the engagement without committing them fully. The remaining Allied ships, deprived of the Genoese element that represented a substantial portion of their fighting power, were exposed. Barbarossa's galleys tore through them. The official Ottoman records describe the capture of 36 Allied ships. European sources suggest the losses were significant, though not as catastrophic as the Ottoman account implies. What is not disputed is the outcome. The Holy League fleet, assembled at enormous cost and effort over 2 years, failed to destroy or even seriously damage Ottoman naval power. It limped back to its various home ports. The Allied coalition, always fragile, effectively dissolved. Barbarossa sailed back to Istanbul in triumph with his captured ships and his prisoners. Sultan Suleiman received him as a hero. The city celebrated. For the next 33 years, no Christian power mounted a serious naval challenge to Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean. Barbarossa had not merely won a battle. He had won an era. The years between Preveza in 1538 and Barbarossa's retirement in 1545 were years of continuous operation at a scale that no single naval commander had previously sustained in the Mediterranean. In 1539, Barbarossa captured a series of islands and coastal positions that extended Ottoman control across the Aegean and the Ionian seas. He retook Castelnuovo, a port on the Adriatic coast, from the Spanish forces that had recently occupied it. He conducted raids along the Italian coast that reached as far north as the waters near Genoa. Venice, which had been a reluctant member of the Holy League, and which had its own complex commercial relationships with the Ottoman Empire, eventually decided that fighting Barbarossa was less important than trading with Istanbul. In 1540, Venice signed a peace treaty with Suleiman that required the Venetians to pay 300,000 gold ducats in reparations. The most powerful independent maritime state in the Mediterranean paid tribute to avoid Barbarossa's fleet. The island of Gibraltar, the coasts of Spain, raids that reached places that the Spanish crown had believed were safe from Ottoman naval power because of the distance from the Ottoman home territories. None of these places were safe.
Barbarossa's fleet had the range and the logistics to operate anywhere in the Mediterranean, and the Spanish government's inability to provide adequate naval protection to its coastal populations was a constant source of political embarrassment and genuine human suffering. In 1541, Emperor Charles V made what he considered a definitive response. He personally led a massive expedition to destroy Algiers, the base from which so much of the corsair activity was directed. He assembled an army of approximately 30,000 soldiers and a fleet to transport them. He was confident enough in the size and quality of his force that he did not wait for the optimal season. He launched the campaign in October. October in the Western Mediterranean is not the summer. In October, storms come. A violent storm struck the Spanish fleet as it approached the Algerian coast. The storm wrecked or scattered a substantial portion of Charles's fleet, drowned thousands of soldiers, and left the expedition unable to execute its planned landing in any organized way. Charles V retreated. Barbarossa, watching from the shore, had not needed to fight. The weather had fought for him. The Spanish Empire, the most powerful military force in the Western world, had tried twice to destroy Barbarossa's North African base, and twice had been driven back. Charles V, humiliated by the failure, reportedly considered an alternative approach. According to historical accounts, he sent an envoy to Barbarossa with an offer. If the Ottoman admiral would switch allegiances, if he would bring his fleet and his expertise to the service of Charles V, he would be made the admiral of the Spanish fleet and given rewards commensurate with his ability. Barbarossa refused. The refusal was not surprising. He had been building his career in service of the Ottoman Empire for decades. His relationship with Suleiman was one of genuine mutual respect and, to the extent the word could apply to the relationship between a sultan and a servant, genuine affinity. He had no reason to trust that Charles V's offer would be honored once his military value had been extracted, and he had every reason to continue with the enterprise that had already made him the most powerful man in the Mediterranean, outside the ruling families of the two great empires. He refused, and Charles went away. The campaign of 1543 and 1544 was the last great operation of Barbarossa's career, and it was, in many ways, the most politically extraordinary thing he did, because it involved something that no one in the 16th century would have predicted, and that shocked Christian Europe when it happened. He spent the winter of 1543 to 1544 in France. He spent it as a guest. France and the Ottoman Empire had been developing a diplomatic relationship since the 1530s, driven by the common interest of both parties in limiting the power of Charles V and the Holy Roman Empire. King Francis I of France and Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had been corresponding, trading ambassadors, and developing the kind of working relationship that was deeply scandalous from the perspective of Christian Europe, since it meant a Christian king was openly allying with the Muslim Empire against other Christians. In 2000 Piset Sorok III, Francis asked Suleiman for active military assistance.
He wanted the Ottoman fleet to participate in a campaign against Spanish and Genoese positions in the Mediterranean. Suleiman dispatched Barbarossa with a fleet of 110 galleys and 30,000 soldiers. Barbarossa sailed west. He conducted operations along the Italian coast. He participated in the siege of Nice, which was then under the control of the Duke of Savoy, a Spanish ally. The siege was partially successful, but did not result in the complete capture of the city, partly because a Spanish relief force arrived, and partly because the coordination between the French and Ottoman forces was imperfect. But the French allowed Barbarossa's fleet to winter at Toulon, the great French naval port on the Mediterranean coast. The population of Toulon was temporarily relocated to accommodate the Ottoman sailors and soldiers who took up residence in the city for the winter months. The call to prayer was heard in Toulon for the months that the Ottoman fleet was based there. The cathedral was reportedly converted for use as a mosque. Christian Europe watched this with horror and amazement. The most Christian king of France had invited the most feared Muslim fleet in the world to winter in a French city. The propaganda value to Charles V was enormous. The practical military value to France was significant.
During that same campaign of 1543, Barbarossa raided the Italian coast extensively. He sacked the island of Ischia, taking 4,000 prisoners. He sacked the Lipari Islands the following year, in 1544, enslaving between 9,000 and 11,000 of the island's inhabitants in what was, by any measure, one of the largest single slave raids in the history of Mediterranean piracy. 9,000 people, the entire population of an inhabited island, taken in chains. The accounts of the Lipari raid describe scenes of comprehensive violence against people who had nowhere to flee and no means of resistance. The island's fortress was overwhelmed. The inhabitants who could not escape were captured. They were transported to North African slave markets or used as rowers in the Ottoman galleys. The island that had had a substantial population before Barbarossa arrived was largely emptied of its people afterward. These were not soldiers. These were fishermen, farmers, craftspeople, the ordinary populations of Mediterranean islands who had the misfortune to be in the territory that Hayreddin Barbarossa's fleet swept through on its way back from the French campaign. This is the dimension of Barbarossa's career that the heroic narrative of the Ottoman admiral who defied Charles V tends to pass over. He was genuinely tactically brilliant. He was genuinely a significant strategic mind who shaped the geopolitics of an entire sea for decades. He was also, without question, the architect of a system that enslaved tens of thousands of civilian non-combatants and conducted raids against populations that had no connection to any military conflict he was engaged in. The two things are both true. The tactical genius and the human cost of the system he built existed simultaneously in the same career, and doing justice to the history requires acknowledging both. By 1545, Hayreddin Barbarossa was approximately 67 years old. He had been fighting continuously, by sea and occasionally by land, for approximately 40 years. He had survived more battles and engagements than could be counted. He had outlived every brother and every rival. He had seen his fleet destroyed and rebuilt, and destroyed again, and rebuilt larger. He had served 3 Ottoman sultans. He had been fought to a standstill by Charles V at Tunis, and had come back stronger. He had beaten the combined fleets of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire and Venice at Preveza. He had wintered in France. He retired. He sailed back to Istanbul and spent his final year writing his memoirs. The document, known as the Gazavat-i Hayreddin Pasha,
or The Deeds of Hayreddin Pasha, was dictated to a secretary and covers the major events of his career. It is one of the primary historical sources for the Barbarossa brothers' lives, and it is remarkable not just for its content, but for its existence.
A man who had spent 4 decades in continuous violent conflict sat down in his old age and wrote his memoirs. He reflected on what he had done and how he had done it. He died on July 4th, 1546, at his summer residence at Büyükdere on the Bosphorus, the waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean that he had spent his life fighting to control. He was between 67 and 68 years old. His death was peaceful. His tomb was built in Istanbul. It was designed by the great Ottoman architect Mimar Sinan, who was also building mosques and palaces for Suleiman the Magnificent at the same period. The tomb of Barbarossa stands today near the Beşiktaş neighborhood of Istanbul, on the edge of the Bosphorus that he had sailed for decades. Ottoman sailors and ships departing for naval campaigns would stop at the tomb to pay their respects and ask for his protection. The tradition persisted for decades after his death. Turkish naval ships passing by the area reportedly still fire a salute to this day. What does the career of Hayreddin Barbarossa mean? How should we understand a man who was simultaneously a genuine military genius, a significant geopolitical actor, a defender of the expelled and the persecuted, and the orchestrator of mass civilian enslavement? The question has no clean answer, and any attempt to provide one by emphasizing one aspect of his career at the expense of another does a disservice to the historical reality. He was genuinely important to the people he protected. The Muslim and Jewish communities expelled from Spain, the thousands of Moriscos who were transported to safety in North Africa by the Barbarossa brothers' corsair fleet, had specific and concrete reasons to regard Hayreddin as a figure of salvation. For those communities, the Barbarossas represented the only organized force that was actively working to protect them against the specific violence of the Spanish Reconquista. He was genuinely terrifying to the communities he raided. The coastal populations of Spain, Italy, and the Mediterranean islands who lived within range of his galleys spent decades in a state of chronic fear that shaped their physical environment, their social organization, and their psychological landscape. The watchtowers that dotted the coastlines, the fortified hilltop towns that replaced coastal settlements, the whole apparatus of alarm systems and defensive architecture that the Mediterranean world built in the 16th century was built because of Hayreddin Barbarossa and the system he led. Both of these things are historical facts. Both of them are true simultaneously. The Battle of Preveza, which is the centerpiece of his historical reputation, was a genuine military achievement of the highest order. He commanded a smaller fleet against the larger coalition force that represented the combined naval power of the major Christian Mediterranean states, and he beat it. He beat it through tactical intelligence, through superior knowledge of his enemy's weaknesses and his own strengths, through the kind of patient, strategic manipulation that forces an opponent into the situation you have prepared for, rather than fighting the battle they have prepared for. His understanding of the political dynamics of the Christian coalition, his ability to read the tensions between Venice and Spain and Genoa, and exploit those tensions to ensure that the coalition could not function as a unified force, was as important as any purely naval tactical decision he made. He was fighting a political battle as much as a naval one, and he won both. But the Lipari Islands raid of 1544, the single largest slave raid in the history of Mediterranean piracy, is also part of his record. 9,000 to 11,000 people, taken from their homes, sold into slavery, their island emptied. He did that too.
The historical figure of Hayreddin Barbarossa cannot be resolved into either a hero or a villain without losing something essential. He was what the 16th century Mediterranean world produced when exceptional ability, long experience, strategic intelligence, and the complete absence of any moral constraint on what could be done to civilian enemies met in the same person and were given the resources of an empire to work with. He was the instrument of Ottoman imperial expansion in the Mediterranean, and that expansion had both beneficiaries and victims, and he was responsible for both. The legacy of Hayreddin Barbarossa extends through several centuries and across multiple traditions. In Turkey, he is a national hero. His image appears on Turkish naval vessels. His tomb in Istanbul is a site of ongoing veneration.
The Turkish naval tradition traces its lineage through him, and the anniversary of the Battle of Preveza is still observed as Maritime Day in Turkey, a national holiday commemorating the victory that established Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean for a generation. In Spain and Italy, particularly in the coastal regions that experienced his raids, his name carried the weight of a historical trauma that lasted long after his death. The word Barbarossa became synonymous in the popular imagination of coastal Mediterranean communities, with the specific terror of galleys appearing on the horizon. Children were frightened with his name for generations. The alarm towers that he indirectly caused to be built stood for centuries, and some survive today as historical monuments. He appears in the popular culture of multiple traditions. The character of Captain Hector Barbossa in the Pirates of the Caribbean films takes his name from the historical Barbarossa. The connection is not just nominal. The fictional Barbossa shares several characteristics with the historical figure: the red beard that gave the name, the commanding presence, the political complexity that makes him neither straightforwardly villain nor hero. But like every attempt to translate Hayreddin Barbarossa into a fictional framework, the films necessarily simplify what was genuinely complex. The historical Barbarossa was operating at the intersection of imperial politics, religious conflict, commercial interest, and individual ambition, in ways that a narrative built around a single protagonist, heroically defying a simple antagonist, cannot capture. He was a potter's son from a Greek island who died as the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman Empire, in a bed in Constantinople after dictating his memoirs, having outlived everyone who had ever tried to kill him. He changed the map of the Mediterranean world. He shaped the history of 4 centuries.
He enslaved tens of thousands of people. He saved tens of thousands of others. He was brilliant and brutal, and strategically sophisticated in ways that his opponents consistently underestimated, until the moment when that underestimation cost them everything. He built a fleet from nothing and used it to define an era. He is buried on the Bosphorus. At the edge of the sea, he spent his life commanding. The ships still salute him as they pass.